Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribing really helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every single one of you. Now, what happens when a company fires its most experienced leaders and the entire technical team walks out in solidarity the same afternoon? Let's get into it. Be me, 39, name is Brennan, and I've spent the last 12 years working as a senior infrastructure engineer at Pinnacle Systems, a company that provides critical back-end services to hundreds of businesses that depend on us to keep their operations running smoothly every single day. This story isn't about anger or revenge. Even though it might sound like it at first, it's really about what I learned about the invisible foundations that hold organizations together and what happens when those foundations are taken for granted. What unfolded over the course of a single afternoon changed my understanding of workplace dynamics, the value of experienced teams, and why the people who build things matter just as much as the people who manage them. I want to share this story not because I want anyone to feel bad or to point fingers at specific people, but because I genuinely believe there are lessons here that could help others avoid similar situations in their own workplaces. Sometimes the most valuable learning comes from experiences that didn't go well, and if my story can help even one person make better decisions about how they treat the people who work alongside them, then sharing it will have been worthwhile. So let me take you back to the beginning to help you understand what Pinnacle Systems was like before everything changed and why what happened there affected so many of us so deeply. Let me give you some context about Pinnacle Systems and what made it such a unique place to work before everything changed, because understanding what we had helps explain why losing it was so significant. We were a mid-sized technology company with about 300 employees, providing infrastructure services, cloud solutions, and back-end support for businesses across multiple industries who trusted us with their most critical operations. The technical division where I worked was the heart of the company, about 60 engineers and specialists who kept everything running, fixed problems before clients even knew they existed, and built the systems that generated 90% of our revenue. When I say we were the heart of the company, I don't mean that arrogantly or to diminish anyone else's contributions. I simply mean that without functioning infrastructure, nothing else the company did would matter. Sales could close deals, marketing could generate leads, executives could set strategy, but if the systems went down and stayed down, clients would leave and revenue would disappear regardless of how good everything else was. That's the nature of infrastructure work. It's invisible when it's working perfectly and only becomes visible when something goes wrong, which means the people who do it well often don't get the recognition they deserve. I joined Pinnacle 12 years ago as a junior engineer fresh out of college, and I learned everything I know from the senior engineers who took the time to mentor me and share their decades of combined experience. Magnus was one of those mentors, a 52-year-old systems architect who had been with the company since nearly the beginning and who understood our infrastructure better than anyone else in the building. There was also Thaddeus, our database administrator, who could diagnose problems in his sleep, and Crawford, our security specialist who had built most of our security protocols from scratch over 15 years of dedicated service. I still remember my first week at Pinnacle, feeling completely overwhelmed by the complexity of the systems I was expected to help maintain, and wondering if I had made a mistake accepting this job. Magnus noticed me struggling, and instead of making me feel worse about it, he pulled up a chair next to my desk and spent 3 hours walking me through the architecture he had designed, explaining not just how things worked, but why they were built that way. That kind of generosity with knowledge was the norm in our technical division. Senior engineers understood that investing in junior team members was how you built a strong organization over time. These men weren't just employees, they were the institutional memory of the company, the people who knew why certain decisions had been made, where the potential problems were hidden, and how to fix things when everything seemed to be falling apart. They had trained most of us younger engineers, shared their knowledge generously, and created a culture where technical excellence was valued above everything else because we all understood that our clients depended on us. Working alongside them was like having access to a living library of solutions, and I never fully appreciated how rare and valuable that was until it was suddenly gone. There's something special about working on a team where everyone genuinely cares about doing excellent work, not because they're being watched or evaluated, but because excellence matters to them personally. That's the culture Magnus and the other senior engineers had built over the years, a culture where cutting corners was unthinkable, where problems were opportunities to learn, and where helping your colleagues succeed was just what you did. I've worked at other companies since then, and I can tell you that kind of culture doesn't happen by accident. It takes years of intentional effort by people who genuinely believe in what they're building. About 2 years ago, the company went through some leadership changes that brought in new perspectives on how the organization should be run, including a new HR director named Miriam, who had strong ideas about transforming the workplace culture. Miriam was 46 years old and came from a background in organizational change management, and she genuinely believed that the company needed significant changes to become more aligned with modern values around diversity and inclusion. I want to be clear that there's nothing wrong with wanting a more inclusive workplace, and I think most of us supported that goal in principle, but the way things unfolded raised questions about whether the approach was serving the company's best interests. The first few months after Miriam arrived were mostly positive, with new initiatives around training, communication, and workplace culture that seemed reasonable and even beneficial in many cases. She organized workshops on effective collaboration, implemented new feedback systems, and created channels for employees to raise concerns about their work environment, all of which seemed like steps in the right direction. Most of us in the technical division were supportive of these efforts because we understood that a better workplace culture benefits everyone, and we wanted Pinnacle to be a place where talented people from all backgrounds could thrive. Over the following months, there was increasing tension between the technical division and the new HR initiatives, not because anyone opposed inclusion, but because the metrics being used to evaluate performance seemed to be shifting away from technical competence toward other criteria. Magnus and the other senior technical leaders expressed concerns about some of the new policies, not in a hostile way, but in the straightforward manner that engineers tend to communicate, pointing out potential problems and unintended consequences. Those concerns were often characterized as resistance to positive change, and over time the relationship between the technical leadership and HR became increasingly strained in ways that made many of us uncomfortable. One example that stands out in my memory was a meeting where Magnus raised questions about a new hiring initiative that seemed to prioritize factors other than technical qualifications for engineering roles. He wasn't opposed to diversifying the team. He simply pointed out that our infrastructure was complex and that bringing in people without adequate technical backgrounds could create safety and reliability risks for our clients. The response from HR characterized his concerns as resistance to change and implied that his focus on technical qualifications was itself a form of bias, which seemed unfair to those of us who understood the legitimate technical issues he was raising. I watched over those months as the relationship between the technical leadership and the rest of the organization became increasingly strained, with each side seeming to misunderstand the other's intentions and motivations. The technical leaders felt that their expertise was being dismissed, while HR seemed to feel that the technical division was resistant to necessary changes, and neither side seemed able to bridge the gap between their perspectives. Looking back, I wish someone had found a way to facilitate better communication between these groups, because I believe most of the conflict came from misunderstanding rather than genuine ill will on either side. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday morning that none of us will ever forget, when we arrived at work to discover that Magnus, Thaddeus, and Crawford had all been terminated effective immediately, along with 4 other senior technical leaders. The official explanation was that the company was restructuring to better align leadership with organizational values, but everyone in the technical division understood that these terminations had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the ongoing tensions. 7 of the most experienced, most knowledgeable people in our entire organization were suddenly gone, escorted out of the building before most of us had even finished our morning coffee. I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard the news, by the coffee machine talking to a colleague about a routine project we were working on, when someone came running up to tell us what had happened. My first reaction was disbelief, because I genuinely couldn't comprehend that the company would let go of people who were so essential to everything we did, people whose knowledge couldn't be replaced no matter how many new hires you brought in. Then the disbelief gave way to something else, a kind of cold clarity about what this decision meant about how the organization viewed the technical team and the work we did. I sat at my desk trying to process what had just happened looking around at my colleagues who all wore the same expression of shock and disbelief that I'm sure was on my own face. These weren't just coworkers who had been let go. These were the people who had built the systems we all depended on, who had trained most of us, who held knowledge in their heads that existed nowhere else. Magnus alone probably had more understanding of our core infrastructure than anyone else in the world, and the idea that he could be replaced as if he were an interchangeable component showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how technical organizations actually work. I thought about all the times Magnus had stayed late to help me solve a problem I couldn't figure out on my own, all the patient explanations he had given me when I was just starting out and didn't understand basic concepts. I thought about the time he came in on a weekend when we had a major system failure, working 18 hours straight to bring everything back online and refusing to leave until he was sure our clients were taken care of. That was the person the company had just decided they didn't need anymore, the person whose 15 years of dedicated service apparently counted for nothing when weighed against whatever other considerations had led to this decision. The first resignation came about an hour after the terminations were announced, from a senior engineer named Parrish who had worked directly under Magnus for 8 years and considered him both a mentor and a friend. Parrish walked into his manager's office, submitted his resignation effective immediately, and explained calmly that he could not continue working for an organization that would treat its most valuable contributors this way. When he walked out of that office, something shifted in the atmosphere of the entire floor, like a signal had been sent that everyone was waiting for without even knowing they were waiting for it. I watched Parrish pack up his desk with quiet dignity, taking down the photos of his family and the awards he had received for his work over the years, and I felt something stirring in my own chest that I couldn't quite name at first. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like a recognition that a line had been crossed, that what had happened that morning changed something fundamental about what it meant to work at this company. If Magnus could be discarded after 15 years of exceptional service, if his expertise and dedication counted for nothing, then what did any of our contributions really mean? Within the next hour, more resignations started coming in, not dramatically or angrily, but quietly and professionally, engineers submitting their 2 weeks' notice, or in some cases, leaving immediately. By lunchtime, I had watched 17 of my colleagues pack up their desks and walk out of the building, and the number kept growing as the afternoon went on and word spread about what was happening. What struck me was how calm everyone was about it. There were no shouting matches or confrontations, just a steady stream of people who had decided they no longer wanted to be part of an organization that operated this way. The quiet professionalism of the exodus was something I'll never forget because it would have been so easy for people to express their anger loudly, to make scenes, to burn bridges on their way out. Instead, they handled it with the same professionalism they had brought to their work every day, submitting proper resignations, offering to help with transitions, treating even an organization that had disappointed them with respect. That professionalism wasn't about being passive or suppressing legitimate feelings. It was about maintaining standards and self-respect even in a difficult situation. I wrestled with my own decision throughout the morning, torn between my loyalty to colleagues I had worked with for over a decade and my practical concerns about my own career and financial stability. I had a family to think about, responsibilities that extended beyond my own preferences, and the job market wasn't guaranteed even for experienced engineers. But watching Magnus' empty office, thinking about everything he had taught me and how his reward for 15 years of dedicated service was being escorted out like he had done something wrong, I realized I couldn't stay either. The decision wasn't about proving a point or making a statement. It was simply about acknowledging that I couldn't give my best work to an organization that had demonstrated such disregard for the people who had given their best work to it. I knew that staying would mean working every day in an environment that no longer felt trustworthy, where the values I had believed the company stood for had been revealed as conditional at best. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from a situation that no longer aligns with who you are and what you believe in. I submitted my resignation that afternoon, joining what had become a coordinated exodus that would ultimately include almost every member of the technical division. When I handed in my letter, My manager looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between understanding and defeat, like he knew there was nothing he could say that would change my mind and nothing the company could offer that would make this right. He thanked me for my years of service and wished me well, and I thanked him for being a good manager, even though he hadn't been able to prevent what had happened. By 5 o'clock that evening, 47 out of 60 technical staff had resigned, with most of the remaining 13 being new hires who hadn't been around long enough to understand what had been lost. The solidarity wasn't planned in advance. There was no secret meeting or conspiracy. It emerged organically from a shared recognition that if this could happen to Magnus and the others, none of us were truly valued for our contributions. What management had failed to understand was that technical teams aren't just collections of interchangeable individuals, they're communities built on trust, shared knowledge, and mutual respect that takes years to develop. That evening, I went home and told my family what had happened, explaining that I'd left my job and that things would be uncertain for a while, but that I believed I had made the right choice. My spouse was supportive in a way that I'll always be grateful for, understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting short-term difficulties for the sake of longer-term integrity. We talked late into the night about what the future might hold, and even though there were no guarantees, there was also a sense of relief that I was no longer part of something that had disappointed me so deeply. The immediate aftermath was chaos, though I only heard about most of it secondhand from colleagues who stayed a few extra days to wrap up their responsibilities because they were professionals who didn't want to leave clients completely stranded. Critical systems started experiencing issues within hours because the people who understood those systems were gone, and the people who remained didn't have the institutional knowledge to diagnose problems quickly. Client calls started coming in as services degraded, and the remaining staff had to explain over and over that the engineers who normally handled these issues were no longer with the company. One story that circulated in the weeks after the exodus was about a relatively simple database issue that would have taken Thaddeus maybe 30 minutes to diagnose and fix, but that took the remaining team 3 days to resolve. The problem wasn't that the remaining engineers were incompetent. They were capable professionals doing their best. It was that they didn't have the specific knowledge of how our systems had been configured and why certain decisions had been made. That knowledge existed only in the heads of people who were no longer there, and no amount of documentation could fully capture the intuition and experience that comes from building and maintaining systems for over a decade. Over the following weeks, I heard through industry contacts that Pinnacle was in crisis mode, bringing in expensive consultants to try to stabilize systems that had been running smoothly for years under the care of people they had just fired. The consultants were technically competent, but they didn't know our specific systems, didn't understand the unique configurations and customizations that had been built up over 15 years, didn't know where to look when something went wrong. What Magnus could have fixed in 10 minutes took teams of consultants days to figure out, assuming they could figure it out at all, and all of that cost money and damaged client relationships. I heard stories about client meetings where account managers had to explain that the engineers who had been serving them for years were no longer with the company, and about the trust that was broken in those conversations. Clients don't just buy services, they buy relationships with the people who provide those services, and when those people suddenly disappear, the relationship has to be rebuilt from scratch with whoever remains. Many clients decided it was easier to find a new provider entirely than to try to rebuild that trust with a company that had demonstrated such instability in its technical leadership. 3 months after the exodus, Pinnacle had lost almost 40% of its client base, with many longtime customers moving to competitors who could offer the reliability they had come to expect from the team that no longer existed. The company that had been valued at over $200 million was now struggling to survive, not because of market conditions or competitive pressure, but because of decisions made in a single day that destroyed decades of accumulated expertise. Miriam was eventually let go as well, though by then the damage was done, and no amount of leadership changes could bring back the institutional knowledge that had walked out the door. I don't take any pleasure in Pinnacle's struggles, and I genuinely feel sorry for the employees who remained and had to deal with the consequences of decisions they hadn't made and probably hadn't supported. The clients who lost service they depended on, the shareholders who lost value, the employees who lost their jobs when the company eventually had to downsize, None of them deserve to suffer for what happened. That's one of the hardest lessons from this experience, that poor decisions at the top of an organization create ripples of consequence that affect many people who had nothing to do with those decisions. Those of us who left mostly landed on our feet because experienced technical professionals are always in demand, especially those who come from organizations known for their technical excellence. Magnus started his own consulting firm, and several of us joined him, building something new together that valued technical competence and treated people with the respect they deserved. The irony is that the team that Pinnacle considered problematic enough to dismantle is now thriving as a competitor, serving many of the same clients who left Pinnacle in search of the reliability and expertise they used to provide. Working at the new firm has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career, not because everything is perfect, but because the culture reflects the values that I believe should guide any professional organization. We evaluate people based on what they contribute. We respect experience and expertise, and we understand that building something excellent requires talented people working together towards shared goals. It's the same culture that existed in Pinnacle's technical division before everything changed, the culture that Magnus and the others had built over many years, now transplanted to a new organization where it can continue to thrive. Looking back on this experience now with some distance and perspective, I've tried to understand what lessons it holds beyond the obvious cautionary tale about respecting your technical talent. The deeper lesson for me is about the invisible infrastructure that holds organizations together, not just the technical systems, but the human knowledge, relationships, and trust that make those systems work. You can't see institutional memory on a spreadsheet. You can't measure the value of someone who knows why a particular configuration decision was made 10 years ago, but when those things are gone, you suddenly realize how essential they were. I also learned something important about solidarity and what it means to work alongside people who share your values and have your back when things get difficult. The 47 people who resigned that day weren't coordinating some kind of protest. They were simply responding individually to a situation that violated their sense of what a workplace should be. That so many of us reached the same conclusion independently says something about the culture that existed in that technical division, a culture built on mutual respect and shared standards that apparently mattered more to us than we had realized. Another lesson I took away from this experience is about the importance of communication and the dangers of allowing misunderstandings to fester without resolution. I believe that most of the conflict between the technical division and HR came from genuine misunderstanding rather than bad intentions, and that with better communication, much of what happened could have been avoided. When people stop trying to understand each other's perspectives and start assuming the worst about each other's motivations, that's when situations spiral out of control in ways that hurt everyone involved. For anyone watching this who finds themselves in a leadership position, I hope this story illustrates why treating experienced employees as expendable is such a dangerous approach to organizational management. The people who build your core systems, who carry your institutional knowledge, who train your new hires, and solve your hardest problems, those people are not interchangeable parts that can be swapped out without consequence. They are the living foundation of your organization, and undermining that foundation in pursuit of other goals, no matter how well-intentioned those goals might be, risks bringing down everything you've built. For anyone watching who is an employee facing a situation where your contributions are being devalued or your colleagues are being treated unfairly, I hope this story shows that you have more options than you might think. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in a system that doesn't respect you, and when enough people make that choice, it sends a message that's impossible to ignore. Your skills and experience have value, and there are organizations out there that will appreciate what you bring rather than treating you as an obstacle to be removed. I also want to acknowledge that not everyone has the luxury of walking away from a job, even one that treats them poorly, and that financial constraints and family responsibilities are real factors that have to be considered. If you're in a situation where leaving isn't an option right now, that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means you're being practical about the realities of your life. Sometimes the wisest course of action is to endure a difficult situation while quietly preparing for the day when you'll be able to make a change, building skills and connections that will open new doors when the time is right. The technical team I work with now, the one we built after leaving Pinnacle, has a culture that I'm genuinely proud of and that reminds me every day what a workplace should feel like. We evaluate people based on their contributions and capabilities. We treat experienced professionals with the respect their knowledge deserves, and we remember that behind every system is a person who understands how it works. That might sound like basic common sense, but apparently it's rare enough to be worth building a company around. My hope in sharing this story isn't to make anyone feel angry or resentful toward the people who made the decisions that led to this outcome, because I genuinely believe most of them thought they were doing the right thing. The lesson isn't about heroes and villains. It's about understanding the consequences of choices and the importance of valuing the people who keep everything running behind the scenes. Every organization has people like Magnus, Thaddeus, and Crawford, quiet professionals whose contribution you might not notice until they're gone, and taking care of those people should be a priority for anyone who wants their organization to thrive. If there's one thing I hope you take away from the story, it's the importance of appreciating the people around you who make things work, whether that's in your workplace, your community, or your personal life. The people who build and maintain the foundations that everyone else depends on often don't get the recognition they deserve, and sometimes a simple acknowledgement of their contribution can mean more than you might realize. Take a moment to thank someone who does important work behind the scenes. Let them know that you see their contribution and that it matters. Thank you for watching this story and for being part of a community that values thoughtful reflection on workplace experiences and the lessons we can learn from them. If this resonated with you or reminded you of something from your own career, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations help us all learn from each other's experiences. Take care of yourselves and the people you work with, and I'll see you in the next one.